Recently, I was invited to lecture on suicide prevention to a college class in adolescent psychology. The professor introduced me, listened intently to the first few moments of my lecture, and then exited the class. The professor did not return until the end of my speech. As I was collecting my handouts, the instructor said, "Say, Rosenthal, you did a pretty good job. I heard a few students talking in the hall and they seemed to like your lecture." I thanked the professor but was totally unprepared for what came next. "You did make one rather glaring error." "Glaring error?" I said. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Well, you made the statement that people who have taken their own lives generally talk about suicide. I remember hearing years ago that this is a myth." "Actually," I explained, "years ago we were taught to believe that people who are suicidal don't talk about it. But today, we know better. We know that a high percentage of individuals who attempt suicide did talk about it." The professor looked perplexed, anxious, and was visibly upset. "Well, that couldn't be true, but if it is, I need to take this seriously." The good professor handed me a note that a student had slid under the educator's door while my lecture was in progress. The note stated that the student was depressed and contemplating suicide. I urged the professor, who had planned on not intervening due to antiquated misinformation about suicide, to contact the student, and fortunately, everything turned out for the best. The bottom line, mental health professionals, yes, even professors in our field, and for that matter, most everybody in our society, often harbor myths about suicide individuals that could prove downright deadly. Myth number 1. Suicidal people don't give warning signs. Fact. Nearly everybody who attempts or dies via suicide communicates intent. The person may talk about suicide, repeatedly joke about it, write about it, place messages on internet chat rooms and discussion groups, or even draw pictures related to death. Others give away prized possessions. Experts now believe that 75 to 80% of all people give warning signs. Number 2, suicide occurs around the holidays. Fact. To be sure, if a suicide occurs on a holiday, it's more likely to get media attention. Nevertheless, December generally checks in as the lowest month for suicide in the United States. In fact, some suicidologists have noticed that all major holidays have a lower rate of suicide, yes, I said lower, than other days of the year, with the notable exception of New Year's Day, which checks in as the highest day for suicides. Myth 3. Suicide occurs more frequently in the dark, dreary days of winter. Fact. Totally false. Most suicides occur in the spring. April, May, and June rates are generally the highest. Myth 4. Suicide is primarily a teenage problem. Fact, indeed. Teen suicide is a problem. The rate of teen suicides about 3 times what it was in the 1960s. However, suicide is a huge issue throughout the entire lifespan. In women, the suicide rate continues to rise until it peaks at about age 51, and then it plateaus and never goes down. In men, the suicide rate keeps increasing with age. A 60-year-old man is more apt to take their own life than is a 50-year-old man, and so on. The rate of geriatric suicide, ages 65 and older, is nearly 3 times the rate of the general population. Myth 5. Most people leave a note that explains the nature of their act. Fact. Only 15 to 25 to maybe 30% leave a note. Moreover, these documents often tell us very little about why the person decided to take their own life. Myth 6. Clients in big cities are under more stress and are more likely to kill themselves. False. Surprise. The suicide rate is clearly higher in sparsely populated rural areas. Densely populated states such as New Jersey or areas like Washington, D.C. have rates that are much lower than those of states such as Wyoming or Alaska that have fewer people per square mile. Myth 7. Media stories about suicide and the economy do not affect the suicide rate. Fact. Researchers have known for a long time that the suicide rate goes down during extended newspaper strikes. When a famous person dies of suicide, the rate increases at a statistically significant level. Suicide, I might add, is an excellent barometer of the economy. In troubled economic times, such as the Great Depression and stock market crash of 1929, the suicide rate skyrocketed. Myth 8. The grief surrounding a suicide is just like any other grief. Fact. Yes, dealing with grief is nearly always very difficult. However, in cases of survivors of suicide, that is to say, those who have lost a friend or a loved one to suicide, they usually have a much tougher time coping with grief. When an individual dies of suicide, the survivors cannot blame a virus or a drunk driver. Suicide prevention centers often provide special survivors of suicide support groups to help those who are grieving deal with the loss. Myth 9. The suicide rate goes up in times of war. Fact. In reality, the suicide rate plummets during times of war or other tragedies. Contrary to popular belief and stories in the media, the 2020 rate went down during the COVID crisis. Myth 10. Never ask a person if they are suicidal, as you could put the idea in their head. Fact. This is one of the most pernicious myths of all time. If you are worried about somebody, make it a point to ask the individual if they are suicidal. To repeat, if you are worried about a friend, acquaintance, loved one, or family member, never be afraid to ask the person you are concerned about. Myth 11. Once a person's depression lifts, the situation is not as dangerous. Fact. A sizable number of people make a suicide attempt after the depression lifts. Hence, this could be the most dangerous time. As a wonderful example, many treatment centers now have aftercare or continuing care groups after a hospital stay ends to help the person deal with this paradoxical reality. Myth 12. Don't bother giving the suicidal individual the number of the suicide prevention hotline if the client insists they won't call it. Fact. Don't buy it. Many people who insist they would never, ever, ever call a suicide hotline do decide to make the call after all. Make it a point to give all suicidal individuals the number of a suicide prevention hotline. In the U.S., 988, that's 988, can be called or texted 24/7 for assistance every day of the year. By fall of 2023, Canada should also have the 988 service. So let's wrap up. Suicide is the 12th leading killer of all people and generally checks in as the second or third top killer of teens and college students. We talk a lot about the horrors of homicide in the United States, and to be sure, homicide is a horrendous problem. Nevertheless, suicide year in and year out causes approximately 2 times more deaths than homicide. To be sure, if a person has made a previous attempt or has substance use issues, the likelihood of suicide increases markedly. I have provided this information as a crash course in emotional life-saving because what you don't know can hurt your clients, friends, co-workers, and family members. And remember, share this video with as many others as you possibly can. Suicide has accurately been described as a permanent solution to a temporary problem. This is Dr. Rosenthal. Have a wonderful day.